In the depths of a forgotten alien world, a mysterious queen believed her child was deaf, unable to communicate with anyone, even her. But as the weight of her responsibilities presses down on her, a seemingly ordinary janitor, a man of humble origins, uncovers a secret that could change everything. His quiet presence, often dismissed, will soon disrupt the fragile balance of power, revealing a truth that no one could have ever anticipated. Before we dive into this incredible journey, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this one resonate with you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's episode will reveal even more shocking truths. The corridor echoed with the soft hum of a distant engine. In the sterile, metallic depths of the intergalactic station, the hum was as familiar as the flickering lights above. It was a sound that accompanied the daily tasks of a janitor, a man whose life was largely unnoticed in the grand web of power. His uniform, faded from years of service, carried the faint smell of industrial cleaners, his hands rough from constant labor. He had learned long ago that silence was his ally, his presence unimportant in a world that didn't see him. But today, something was different. The Queen of Threxion, the ruler of 1,000 worlds, had just returned from her tribunal. Her towering figure, wrapped in royal crimson, entered the room with the grace of a storm. Despite her unmatched power, there was a visible weariness in her posture, a weight that burdened even the most regal of shoulders. Her eyes, sharp as daggers, scanned the room, dismissing all who dared meet her gaze. She was a queen who commanded the silence of the stars. Yet, amidst the silence, a whisper broke through, soft and subtle, a sound so quiet it could have been mistaken for a trick of the mind. But it wasn't. It was a whisper of a name, spoken with the tenderness of a secret that only the closest could understand. Her child, whom she had believed to be mute, sat alone in the corner of the room. The little one, a child with emerald eyes and rainbow-colored hair, held a small teddy bear tightly in her arms. The moment was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but in that whisper, a name, her name, spoken by the janitor, everything began to change. The queen froze, her expression hardened, and for a moment the room felt impossibly still. The janitor, unnoticed by most, stood at the far end, mop in hand. His expression betrayed nothing, but in his gaze there was something deeper, something no one had ever expected to find beneath his humble exterior. The whisper was enough. The queen knew without a doubt that her child was not deaf, and in that moment, she realized she had underestimated the quiet man who, until now, had been nothing more than a shadow in her empire. Elias had always been invisible. It was a fact he had learned to embrace long ago. As the janitor of the Threxion royal palace, he existed in the background, a nameless face, a shadow in the corridors, always working but never seen. His duties were simple: clean the floors, scrub the walls, empty the trash. It was monotonous, yet it provided him with a sense of purpose in a universe that had long forgotten his kind. He had no ambitions, no grand dreams. His life, for better or worse, was confined to the small spaces where no one else wanted to be. But today, things felt different. The whisper that had echoed through the room, barely audible but unmistakable, had changed everything. He hadn't meant for the queen to hear it. He hadn't meant for anyone to hear it. His only purpose had been to finish his work, to clean the floors as he had done 1,000 times before. And yet, in that moment, something shifted. The queen's eyes, once cold and dismissive, now lingered on him with an intensity that made him uneasy. She had not spoken, but there was a presence about her that spoke volumes. The room was still. Even the attendants and guards, who had always treated him as a mere object, now seemed to hesitate, unsure of what to make of the sudden attention. Elias swallowed, trying to ignore the growing weight of their stares. He had no desire for confrontation, no need for recognition. All he wanted was to finish his shift and disappear into the shadows once more. But the queen did not move. Her gaze was fixed on him, unwavering, as though trying to decipher something that was hidden beneath his ordinary exterior. She had heard the name of someone who was supposed to be forgotten, someone who was thought to have been lost to the winds of time. Elias felt the weight of her gaze like a physical force pressing against him. He kept his head down, his eyes focused on the floor, trying to maintain the calm facade he had perfected over the years. But inside, his mind raced. How had the Queen's child, known his name? How had she whispered it so clearly, so knowingly, in the quiet of the room? The Queen's daughter, whom Elias had never heard speak before, had called his name as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And in that single, fleeting moment, Elias felt something stir within him, a forgotten memory, a long-buried truth. He had been part of something once, something important. But that was a lifetime ago, a time when he had been someone else. The person he was now, the janitor, the invisible man, was all that remained. But now, for the first time in years, Elias felt a sense of purpose stirring in his chest. The Queen's gaze was not just an acknowledgement of his existence. It was a recognition, and whatever secrets lay hidden in that moment, they were about to unravel. The days that followed were filled with an eerie silence. The events in the royal chamber had left an indelible mark on Elias. Every time he stepped into the grand halls to perform his duties, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was different now. The walls, once indifferent to his presence, seemed to watch him more closely. The guards, who had ignored him for years, now kept a subtle eye on his movements. Even the air itself felt charged, as if the universe were holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. But nothing was spoken. No one addressed the strange moment with the Queen's child. The palace continued on as if it were business as usual, the hum of power ever present. Elias did his work with the same routine he had followed for years, but now, his every motion felt deliberate, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. He knew the Queen had heard the whisper. She had frozen, her icy exterior cracking for just a moment, and yet she had said nothing. The room had filled with tension, but no words followed. The child's name had been spoken, and Elias had heard it. There was no turning back from that moment. The days bled into one another, each as silent as the last, but Elias could not escape the feeling that something was waiting just beyond the horizon. His heart, once content in its quiet rhythm, now raced in the silence. He had never asked for attention, he had never wanted to be noticed, but there was no denying it now. The Queen had seen him, the child had acknowledged him. One evening, as the shadows lengthened and the palace quieted, Elias found himself alone in the vast corridor, mopping the floors beneath the flickering lights. The echoes of his footsteps bounced off the cold marble, the sound harsh in the stillness. He had long ago learned to avoid making noise, to keep to the edges of the palace, invisible to all who passed by. But tonight, there was no avoiding the weight of the Queen's gaze, no escaping the thought of her child's whisper. He paused, his mop hovering in mid-air, and turned his gaze toward the distant throne room. Behind the grand doors, he knew she waited. The Queen, surrounded by her advisors, plotting, scheming. Her empire was vast, but even in its might, she had failed to see the truth standing right before her. The child was not deaf. The child had been speaking all along, and Elias had heard it. But the question remained. Why had the child whispered his name? What bond existed between them, one that the Queen had overlooked for so long? The answer was out there, hidden in the corners of his past, a past he had buried deep within himself. With a deep breath, Elias continued his task, the mop moving slowly across the floor, his mind racing with possibilities. The quiet palace seemed to grow even more silent, as though waiting for the moment when everything would finally shatter. And in the silence, Elias could only wonder if he was ready to uncover the truth that had been locked away for so long. The night was long and restless, filled with the sound of distant thunder as storms raged outside the palace walls. Inside, the cold, immaculate halls of the royal complex seemed to hum with a different kind of energy, one that was heavier than any storm. The tension had not lifted since the moment the Queen had locked eyes with Elias, and though no words had been exchanged, the unspoken understanding between them was undeniable. The Queen knew something had shifted. Elias couldn't sleep. The silence in his quarters felt oppressive, as though the weight of the universe had descended upon him. His hands, which had long ago learned to ignore pain, now ached with something far deeper, a hunger for answers, for truth, for understanding. He had known from the start that his life would never be the same after that whisper. He had never been part of anything bigger than the simple duties of a janitor, yet now he was tied to the Queen in a way he couldn't explain. Her child, the one whom everyone had believed to be deaf, had spoken his name, and for some reason, that moment had sparked a chain of events he couldn't undo. The following day, he returned to his duties in the palace with his usual quiet diligence. He scrubbed the floors, emptied the waste, cleaned the endless hallways, but his every move felt scrutinized, as though the walls themselves were watching him. He couldn't escape the feeling that someone was always just a step behind, waiting for him to slip, to reveal something he wasn't aware of. It was late in the evening when he was summoned. A soft chime rang through the palace, signaling an official request. Elias wiped his hands on his jumpsuit and walked toward the throne room, his feet moving of their own accord. He had no idea why he was being called, but he had learned not to question the commands of those who held power over him. He reached the massive doors, their golden handles gleaming in the low light. His heart beat faster now, a steady drum, quickening with anticipation. When the doors opened, Elias stepped inside. The grand chamber was lit by dim, flickering torches, casting long shadows across the floor. The Queen was seated upon her throne, her regal form casting an imposing figure in the center of the room. Around her were her advisors, who fell silent at his entrance. The Queen's eyes, cold and calculating, fixed on him immediately. "You," she said, her voice echoing in the vast chamber. "Step forward." Elias hesitated but obeyed. As he approached, he felt the weight of the Queen's gaze settle upon him like a physical presence. The room was still, save for the quiet rustle of her cloak as she shifted in her seat. Her face was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of something ancient, something knowing. "Tell me," the Queen began, her voice low and steady. "How is it that you are connected to my daughter? How is it that she spoke your name, a name that should be forgotten?" Elias stood frozen, the question hanging in the air like a trap. He had no answer, not yet. But he could feel the moment stretching out, the tension thickening. The truth was within reach, but how much of it was he ready to face? Elias stood before the Queen, his heart pounding in his chest like a wild drum. Her question hung in the air, heavy and insistent, but it wasn't the question that had him frozen in place. It was the look in her eyes, a look that demanded answers, that expected truths to be revealed, whether he was ready or not. For a moment, the world outside the throne room faded into nothing. The only thing that mattered now was the Queen's gaze and the silence between them. His hands, still trembling from the weight of her attention, clenched into fists at his sides. He wasn't sure what to say. He wasn't sure what he even could say. He had spent years burying his past, hiding it from those who might remember or question it. But in this room, under the Queen's watchful eyes, there was no escape from what he had tried so hard to forget. He started, his voice rough, like a stone scraping against stone. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I don't know what you mean, Your Majesty." The Queen's gaze didn't falter. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing, as though she could see through his words, through his silence. "I know what I heard, Elias. My daughter whispered your name. You must be connected to her in some way. Tell me the truth. How do you know her?" Elias swallowed hard, the knot in his throat tightening. His past was a closed door, one he had sealed shut long ago. He had moved on from the life he once had, from the man he used to be. But in that moment, standing before the Queen, a figure of power, a ruler of worlds, he felt as if that door was about to be torn open. The past had a way of resurfacing, no matter how far you ran from it. "I used to know someone," he said slowly, his voice quieter now, as though speaking the words aloud might make them too real. "A long time ago. She taught me things I didn't understand at the time." The Queen's eyes flickered with interest. She said nothing, but there was an unmistakable shift in her presence. She was waiting, and Elias knew that this moment, this conversation would set the course for everything that was to come. His mind raced, his thoughts tangled in a knot of memories. He could feel his heart pounding against his ribs, the weight of the years pressing down on him. He didn't want to go there. He didn't want to drag up the past, to remember the woman who had shaped him, who had been a part of him, but he had no choice, not anymore. Her name was Mara, Elias whispered, the name tasting bitter on his tongue. She was the one who taught me to listen, to hear things others couldn't, to see what wasn't there. But that was a lifetime ago. The Queen's eyes softened for a brief moment, as if something in his words had struck a chord. "And what happened to her?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias looked away, his gaze falling to the floor, where the faint marks of his work lingered. He knew the answer, but he didn't want to say it. He didn't want to revisit the past that had torn his life apart. But the truth was inevitable. The truth had always been there, waiting. "She's gone," Elias said, the words heavy with finality. "And with her, everything I knew." The Queen remained silent for a long moment, her gaze never leaving Elias. The weight of his words lingered in the air, filling the vast, cold chamber. His admission had cracked something open, not just for him, but for her as well. There was something about his quiet grief, his quiet truth, that resonated in a way that words never could. Elias shifted uneasily under her stare. He had not meant to reveal so much, but once the door to the past was opened, it couldn't be closed again. He could feel the heat of her eyes, weighing him down, pressing him into the marble floor. But still, he didn't look up. His focus remained on the ground beneath his feet, the mop he had held earlier, now nothing more than a forgotten tool. I didn't know what to do with her teachings," Elias murmured, barely above a whisper. "She spoke of things beyond our world, beyond Threxion, and I wasn't ready to understand them then. I couldn't." His voice broke slightly, the weight of his own words hitting him harder than he had anticipated. "She made me promise never to speak of it, to forget everything, and to live as I am." The Queen's lips pressed into a thin line, but her expression softened. It was clear that his words had struck a chord deep within her. Despite the icy distance she maintained, the vulnerability she wore, however faint, was undeniable. Her eyes flickered briefly to the child in the corner of the room, still sitting quietly with her teddy bear, her gaze distant as if she were lost in thought. A deep sadness seemed to settle over the Queen, but she said nothing, only watching Elias, waiting for him to continue. "I couldn't forget," Elias continued, his voice gaining strength now. "I could never forget her, and I could never forget the lessons she gave me. Lessons about listening, really listening, to the things that are hidden from everyone else." His voice dropped again, as if the weight of the confession was too much to bear. "That's how I knew her name, how I knew you, your child. She's not deaf, Your Majesty, she's listening." The Queen's eyes widened at this, and for the first time since Elias had entered the room, her stoic composure faltered, her sharp gaze fixed on him, calculating, as if weighing his every word. There was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, a shadow of something long buried. For a moment, Elias could see the Queen not as a ruler, but as a mother, a woman who had been searching for something and had never known where to look. "She's been listening all along," Elias said, his voice a little more certain now. "To you, to your people, and to something else." He paused, looking up at the Queen for the first time, meeting her gaze directly. "She's hearing the truth that no one else can hear." The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension palpable as Elias's words sank in. The Queen's eyes flickered, as if searching for something in the space between them, and for the briefest moment, she appeared to be on the verge of understanding. But the moment passed quickly, leaving only silence. The truth had been spoken, but what would be done with it? And what would it mean for Elias, for the Queen, and for the child who had unknowingly set everything in motion? The Queen stood silently for a long while, her thoughts clearly a tempest behind her composed exterior. Elias stood before her, no longer the humble janitor, but a man carrying the weight of forgotten truths. The air between them was thick, filled with the silent echoes of what had been revealed, and yet neither spoke for what felt like an eternity. Elias couldn't bring himself to look up. His heart raced, his pulse thudding in his ears, as he waited for the Queen's response. What would she do with this revelation? Would she demand more answers? Would she punish him for his audacity to speak out of turn, to disrupt the carefully constructed facade of her perfect empire? But as the seconds stretched on, Elias realized that the Queen was not a woman accustomed to silence, at least not this kind. She was used to commanding respect, to bending people to her will. But here, in this moment, there was nothing she could command. The truth had already been spoken, and there was no going back. Finally, she moved. The queen's tall, regal form shifted as she descended from her throne. Her cloak fluttered behind her, the vivid crimson fabric catching the light as she moved toward Elias. There was no anger in her steps, no disdain. Instead, there was a quiet intensity, a kind of understanding that, for the first time, seemed to bridge the gap between them. "You've spoken the truth," she said, her voice low, barely more than a murmur. "And now you must live with the consequences of that truth." Elias's breath caught in his throat. Consequences. He had feared that word, feared what it might mean for him, for the child. But he had no choice now. He had spoken, and in speaking, he had uncovered something larger than himself. "I understand," Elias replied, his voice strained but steady. "I never asked for any of this, Your Majesty. But it was always there, wasn't it? The truth." The queen's gaze softened, a flicker of something vulnerable passing through her eyes before it was hidden again behind her usual cold composure. She regarded him for a moment longer, as though weighing him, and then nodded slowly. "Your life as you know it will change from this moment forward," she said. "You will no longer be invisible, Elias. You will no longer be just a janitor, lost in the shadows of this palace." Elias's mind raced. What did that mean? What was she asking of him? He had never desired power, never wanted to stand in the light, but something told him that whatever path the queen was now setting him on, he couldn't walk away from it. "You will be the one to teach her," the queen continued, her voice firm now. "The truth she has been hearing all along. You will be her guide." Elias's heart sank. He didn't know if he was ready for that. To teach a child, the heir to an empire, the things he had learned in the shadows. But the queen's gaze left no room for argument. This was no request, it was a command. "Do you accept?" she asked, her voice quiet, but carrying the weight of 1,000 worlds. Elias hesitated for just a moment before he nodded. He had no other choice. The past had been set into motion, and the future, though uncertain, was now in his hands. "I accept." The palace was still as Elias walked through its vast halls, the weight of the queen's decision pressing heavily on his shoulders. He had been given a task, one that no janitor, no man of his position, could ever have imagined. To teach the queen's child the truth, to be her guide in a world filled with secrets. The gravity of it felt almost unreal. What did he know of teaching, of guiding a child who had been hidden away, sheltered from the world outside? And yet, here he was, standing at the threshold of her chambers, preparing to do something he had never thought possible. The door opened with a soft click, and Elias stepped inside. The child was seated in the center of the room, a place of quiet refuge. She was surrounded by soft, glowing lights, her rainbow-colored hair flowing like a living river. Her wide eyes, filled with curiosity and innocence, were focused on him as he entered. The child said nothing, but there was a strange knowing in the way she watched him, as though she had been waiting for him all along. Elias hesitated. The task ahead of him was nothing like he had imagined. There were no lessons, no textbooks to fall back on. There was only the quiet, unspoken bond between them, the connection that had been formed in the shadows, hidden from the eyes of the world. His mind raced with the weight of it all. How could he teach her? How could he unravel the tangled threads of knowledge that had been passed down to him by someone long gone? He took a deep breath and stepped forward. The room was quiet, but the air between them felt charged, alive with potential. He didn't know where to start, but somewhere deep inside, he knew the first step would be simple. "Listen," Elias said softly, kneeling down to her level. "You've always been able to hear the truth. It's in the silence, in the things that no one says aloud. You have to listen with more than your ears. You have to listen with your heart." The child tilted her head, her expression serious. She didn't speak, but Elias could see the flicker of understanding in her eyes. She was listening, not just to him, but to something deeper, something that had always been there, waiting for her to find it. "There are things that words can't explain," Elias continued, his voice gentle. "Things that are too big, too powerful for language. But you can feel them, if you're paying attention. You can hear them. if you listen carefully enough. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, a shard of glass, smooth and dark, its surface reflecting the dim light of the room. "This is a symbol," he said, "a symbol of the truth that's always been just out of reach. It's a key, but only if you know how to use it." The child reached out, her small hand brushing the shard. She didn't speak, but Elias could see the flicker of recognition in her eyes. She knew what it was, even if she didn't fully understand it yet. "You'll learn," Elias said quietly. "You'll learn to listen to the truth in ways that others can't." The child held the shard gently, her gaze fixed on it, as though it held the answers to questions she had never even thought to ask. In that moment, Elias knew that he had begun something far greater than he could have imagined. And in the quiet of the room, the first lesson began. The days that followed felt different. Elias continued his work, but his thoughts were always on the child. Every lesson, every quiet moment spent with her, showed her growing connection to something larger than herself. Elias had never expected her to learn so quickly, but her instincts were sharper than he had anticipated. She didn't speak often, but when she did, it was as if she already knew things that others couldn't understand. One evening, as the last light of the day filtered through the windows, Elias presented the child with a new object, a shard of pale glass he had found in the palace garden. It was delicate, almost fragile, but it hummed with an energy Elias could feel. "This is a symbol," Elias explained quietly. "A piece of the truth you're starting to hear." The child reached out, her small hand brushing the shard, and to Elias's astonishment, it began to glow softly. The light was faint but steady, pulsing like a heartbeat. Elias held his breath. The child looked at the shard, then up at him. Her eyes widened, filled with a knowing that only she could understand. She didn't need to ask questions, she simply understood. "What did you hear?" Elias asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The child's voice was soft when she finally spoke. "I hear the echoes of the past, the stories of those who came before me. I hear their names." Elias's heart raced. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. The truth was unfolding, not in words, but in the quiet understanding between them. She was beginning to hear the truths that had been hidden for so long. "You'll learn," Elias murmured, more to himself than to her. "You'll learn to listen to the truth." The child's small fingers curled around the glowing shard, her gaze fixed on it, as if it held the answers to everything. Elias knew then that she was ready. The path ahead would not be easy, but it would be hers to walk. The days passed quickly, each one heavier than the last. Elias continued his lessons with the child, but something had shifted. The queen had begun to notice the change in her daughter, and her presence loomed over Elias. He could feel her watching, waiting for him to slip, for the truth to be undone. But he had no intention of turning back. One evening, the queen summoned him once more. He entered her chambers, his heart pounding with the weight of the moment. She sat on her throne, her regal presence like a storm waiting to break. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, were fixed on him as he approached. "You've done something," the queen said, her voice colder than ever. "Something I cannot ignore." Elias stood still, meeting her gaze. "I've done nothing but teach her." "You've awakened something in her," the queen replied, her tone darkening. "Something I never intended to be awakened." The queen rose from her throne, her presence towering over him. "You've set things in motion that cannot be undone." Elias met her gaze firmly, his own resolve growing. "Then let them unfold." The queen's eyes narrowed, her voice like a whisper now. "The question remains, Elias. When the time comes, will she listen to you?" The silence that followed felt like a weight, the air thick with unspoken tension. Elias didn't answer. He knew the truth now. The child, the queen's heir, was no longer just a passive force in her empire. She had a voice, a truth of her own, and soon the galaxy would have to reckon with it. The queen's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before she turned away. The empire's future had already begun to shift, and with it, Elias's place in it had changed forever.